Welcome to the Asia Climate Finance podcast, where our host and his guest discuss and evaluate climate business and climate finance issues and trends. Please support us by liking and subscribing to the podcast. Also, please note the disclaimers at the end of the show. Here is your host, investor analyst and author, Joseph Jacobelli.
Hello and welcome to the Asia Climate Finance podcast. Before we begin, I have a very quick personal message. Today is an exciting day as we publish our 50th episode, a significant milestone for the Asia Climate Finance podcast. Since March 2022, we've had 50 insightful conversations with esteemed experts on various climate finance topics. You may know that the podcast is completely independent and non-commercial. It's purely driven by personal passion. My aim is to raise awareness about key issues and trends in climate finance within the Asia-Pacific region. Please do support this initiative by liking, subscribing, or reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your preferred platform. Now, on to today's topic, an analysis of national and corporate transition trends in Asia. Our distinguished guest is Dr. Sayuri Shirai. Dr. Shirai serves as an advisor for sustainable policies at the Asia Development Bank Institute in Tokyo. She is also professor of economics at Keio University. Additionally, she had prominent roles at the IMF and the Bank of Japan. Our discussion begins with a chat on adaptation and mitigation in Asia. We then delve into the phase down or phase out of coal-fired power plants in the region. And finally, we explore corporate climate disclosure and transition planning. Enjoy the show. Thank you very much for being with us today. I really appreciate it. Professor Shirai, could you maybe start by telling us a little bit about the Asia Development Bank Institute? I mean, I'm familiar obviously with ADB, but not as familiar with the Institute. And given you're an advisor there, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about it.
Yes. So Asian Development Bank Institute, ADB Institute, belong to ADB. So ADB, as you know, it's a well-known regional development bank. So ADB Institute is research. It's a think tank, okay? But it's located in Tokyo, whereas the headquarters of ADB is located in Manila. And the ADBI provide a lot of research activities related to development, including climate change, but also it provides a lot of capacity building seminars. Training, and we do a lot of training for the bureaucrats, central banks, and then also private sectors.
Which is something which, I think capacity building is actually what the whole podcast is all about, is because I believe that for climate finance, whether it's bureaucrats or corporations, we really need to kind of explain all of the various tools that are available and how they are available for climate finance. So maybe I can get right into the conversation, Professor Shirai, with regards to kind of some broad climate finance issues. Could you please share your thoughts on adaptation in Asia, perhaps with reference to first island nations, secondly to lower income economies, and lastly with countries with heavy industry needing to cut GHGs?
So adaptation is becoming very, very important since the global temperature is getting much higher than everybody thought. So every country has to prepare for this hazard arising from climate change. Especially small island like Fiji, Marshall Island, etc. They are really facing a lot of risk. So as you know, they are already facing this sea level rise and a lot of flooding in coastal areas. So they need a lot of more money and to protect their countries. But the money is not enough. So that is one issue. For a lot of low-income countries located in Southeast Asia and South Asia, they are already also suffering quite a lot from this hurricane, typhoon, flooding, and then also because their infrastructure is not enough, so there is a lot of losses in terms of people's life and infrastructure. In terms of advanced country, more industrialized advanced country like Japan, we do also have a lot of adaptation program, but compared to low-income country or island nations, we already build up a lot of infrastructure. So relatively more resilient to various hazards. So of course we have a lot of losses, but relative losses are smaller.
And in terms of mitigation, Asia still has substantial amounts of, coal-fired power plants. It's a very hot topic in the climate finance world. So in climate finance, how are we going to finance or structure the phase down or the phase out of these plants? Do you have any thoughts?
Yes. So let me clarify the difference between adaptation and mitigation. So adaptation is, we are adapting to this global climate change, and especially, low-income countries, they are suffering. In terms of mitigation, so we have to reduce these greenhouse gas emissions. And mostly this is coming from, our modern living standard and manufacturing sector, etc. So Asia, we are facing very serious mitigation problems because Asia depends a lot on coal fuel power plants. For example, if you look at the ratio of coal power plants, in total electricity generation, these coal power plants account for 75%, like China, Indonesia, 60%, like Japan, Korea, 32%. That is extremely high. So which means Asia depends too much on this coal power plant. So naturally, we expect just a continuous increase in GHG emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. So how to deal with these economies? So especially Asian developing countries, like emerging economy and developing country, a lot of coal power plants, the operational year is very young. So average is only 14 years. Okay, so we cannot wait until those coal power plants become old after 30, 40 years, and then we can replace it with renewable energy. That may be possible for Japan, but for a lot of emerging Asian countries, still operating year is so young, 14 years. So it's not possible to replace it. Then in the meanwhile, the economy is growing and the population is growing, so they have a high demand for electricity. Now, for many Asian countries, still relatively cheap to use coal power plants compared to the renewable energy. It's because, for example, some countries like Indonesia, they are producing it. And also, in order to use renewable energy, we need more sophisticated, demand side adjustment, right? Using technology, depending on the peak period, perhaps the government can adjust the pricing so that some of the manufacturing can take place at night at a cheaper price, at the lower prices. So such kind of adjustment is very sophisticated, and we often need, digital technology. So it's not so easy to install this renewable energy for a lot of Asian countries, and they worry that, if they switch to the renewable energy, they may not be able to have a stable energy supply. And therefore, there is a very slow process for Asia to increase the renewable energy. So then what we should do? So of course, for the new energies, it's ideal to increase renewable energy. But at the same time, what are we going to do with this existing many coal fuel power plants? So naturally, I think we have to apply a technology such as CCS, carbon capture storage. Some investment is needed, or some co-firing with hydrogen or hydrogen-derived fuel such as ammonia. And Japan is quite good at this technology, and I think China also experimenting some of this technology. Because without that, so many new coal power plants, and then they are emitting a lot of emissions. So we have to find a way to mitigate those emissions. So that is an issue. At the same time, I think some Asian country, they can try to phase out some of existing fossil fuel coal power plants. We call managed phase out. So suppose some coal power plants in Philippines or Indonesia, they have 7 more years before closing it. Let's retire 7 years before, and then try to switch to the renewable energy. That is an experiment conducted by Asian Development Bank with a lot of support from a developed country. So that is another way. But how to find money to do such kind of is very extremely difficult. We have to have this package of various measures.
And just a follow-up question, if I could, with regards to coal-fired power plants phase down or phase out. Money, as you mentioned, is a major issue because a lot of the countries, for example, in Southeast Asia, that should be doing it, like Indonesia or Vietnam or the Philippines, don't exactly have the funds to do it. And I heard of solutions such as using carbon credits to finance part of this. What are your views with regards to financing? Do you think that we can find pools of money from developed countries or maybe some other ADB as well as some other maybe multilateral development banks? How do you feel about that? What are your thoughts?
Yes. So ideally, if a lot of companies are willing to purchase sort of carbon credit, which are coming from the saving of GHG emission as a result of a phase out of coal power plants. That is kind of Singapore is doing right now. We are jointly some experimentation with NGO in the United States for the case of Philippines, I think. Okay, so they are doing some experiment, but at this moment there are not much demand for such kind of credit. First of all, even for the carbon credit arising from like a nature-based solution like forestation or other a lot of emission mitigation carbon credit, still demand is not high. The reason is that I think globally every government hasn't done enough climate policies such as carbon pricing. So people haven't really taken a lot of action yet on the corporate side and also government side. So that's why there are not enough demand. But as each government is trying to do more climate policy to meet their because they are committed to the net zero emission, right? So they have to do more policies. So as each country starts to do more policy, and then means that after all, corporate sector have to do it to reduce the GHG emission. And I think people start to increase the demand for such carbon credit. But at this moment, there are very little demand. And then besides that, carbon credit arising from this early coal phase out is a bit new, right? So I think people have to understand what it means. How is it different from nature-based solution? I mean, is it, I think they have to have a more learning and a more, they have to find a credible way to increase people's trust.
And then we go back to the importance of capacity building and the work that ADB Institute is doing. This is a good segue to talk a little bit about a subject which is very close to my heart, which is corporations and corporate action. Now, governments are the key drivers of the energy transition as they may determine the direction and speed of change through their policies. Pretty much like the captain of a ship. I would argue, though, that the central actors are also corporations. They execute the nitty-gritty investments, and perhaps we could discuss corporates, starting with the issue of disclosure. What type of disclosures are we talking about when we're talking about corporations?
So basically, disclosures are for investors, okay? And so we want to scale up the finance for climate. Now, what kind of information investors want? First of all, they like to know how serious the companies are in terms of their commitments to the net zero target. So the company has to describe who is responsible for this, collecting data and conducting strategy. The board members, are they all aware and are they monitoring it? So that kind of governance is most important. So they have to describe that. The second thing is strategy. So suppose the companies are committed to net zero emissions. How are they going to achieve it? I mean, how much are they going to spend, capital spending, for the new technology and the new goods and services? How are they going to engage with suppliers? Because for the company A, when they talk about GHG emission reduction, actually they have to incorporate the emission coming from suppliers, upstream and downstream. So big company should engage with suppliers and then work with them and then think about how to reduce GHG emission. So not just the company's factory, but suppliers like materials, machinery producers. So everybody have to work on. So the big company have to describe what are their strategy, the detailed strategy to achieve net zero. That is strategy section. And then risk management. So there are so many different kind of climate-related risk, but for each companies, depending on which sector they belong to, and also locations, the type of risk they are facing are different depending on the companies. So company have to explain how do they identify which material, which risks are more material than others. So how to identify those specific climate-related risk, and then which is more material than others. So those kind of risk management is also important. Finally, most importantly, so company has to clarify the metrics and target. So most important metrics is GHG emissions data, but there are many others like energy consumption, water consumption, disposal volume, etc. So the company have to describe all those important metrics and also target related to those metrics. So those are the package of the disclosures.
There's one, so we already discussed the kind of the wider disclosures and what disclosures. There's one area which I believe you know quite a bit about, which is the ISS. And I was wondering if you could, first please describe that, and then, talk about the importance of that becoming a global standard, and also where are we at in Asia?
Yes. Actually, it's ISSB. Mm-hmm. So it stands for International Sustainability Standard Board. This was created in 2021 by IFRS Foundation. So they are non-governmental organization which compile global financial accounting. It's called IFRS. So everybody knows this foundation. So it was natural for them to also establish ISSB. So on the one hand, they are having a standard for regular financial statement, right? Like cash flow, profit, balance sheet. And then on the other hand, they are now preparing the sustainability related this standard. So that's why ISSB was created. And ISSB is becoming a global standard, which incorporate all these important elements, which I just explained, such as governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and target, right? And so this is becoming quite important. However, a country like Japan, we already know about their standard. But when I look at Asia, not everybody knows about this ISSB. Because in Asia, there are other standards, such as GRI standard, which is much broader than the ISSB. Because ISSB basically focus on the impact of climate change on profit, sales and cash flow. Whereas a GRI standard is like, not only just looking at the impact of climate change to the financial performance, but also companies' impact on environment and climate change, sort of externalities. So two ways. So GRI standard is quite well known. It's quite already established in Asia. So I think, there's a lot of issue here. So everybody already started to understand about GRI standard, and then many companies in Asia, they already, doing disclosure based on GRI standard. Whereas the ISSB is a bit more narrowly defined, which is more, preferred by investors because it's more narrowed, impact on the financial performance. So how to improve the understanding of ISSB in many countries in the world, including Asia, is very challenging. I think Southeast Asia, ASEAN countries, they started to understand about this ISSB, so they are going to accept it as part of their disclosure. But still, I talked to a lot of countries, but a lot of countries haven't known much about this ISSB standard.
Professor Shirai, you referred earlier about corporate disclosure, and one area being, the corporate transition planning for individual companies. What about in the Asia context in general? Where are we at? My gut feeling is that we're probably in Asia, we're a little bit behind Europe and perhaps a little bit ahead of North America. What are your feelings about that? Where are we at in terms of the development?
Yes. So when I look at the global development, the Europe, especially European Union, is a front runner in every sense. Already from this year, they started to apply detail of ESG, so not only climate, but social and the governance issue, ESG issue. They are requiring a lot of company in Europe to start to disclose by law already from this year, and it incorporate more comprehensive metrics than ISSB. Okay, and also within Euro area, within European Union, big commercial banks also have to do a lot of disclosure on climate and the ESG issue. So it's by law. So it's far more stringent than any other region and country in the world. So Europe is way ahead, I think. And also Europe, their ratio of renewable energy is rising despite the energy shocks, and they are quite committed to this increase in renewable energy. But Asia, as you know, haven't really found a way to cope with these coal power plants yet. Yeah. Because going back to this CCS or coal-firing with hydrogen, technology is there, but still they need to develop the more advanced technology. Okay, technology is there, but they have to do much more, and also extremely costly at this moment. So at this moment it's not possible to use it for commercial purposes. So how to advance technology and also lowering costs such as CCS or co-firing with hydrogen is extremely challenging. And then at this moment, Asia haven't really come up with credible pathway leading to the net zero. So I think that's one of the reasons why when your question is about corporate transition planning, I know a lot of a big company in Asia, they try to do it, but it's not really clear yet. I think it's partly because of how to deal with this fossil fuel in Asia is not clear yet. That's why I keep saying Asia have to discuss together, and they have to cope with this, Asian-specific features together.
No, I totally agree with that. In one of your many publications, you wrote that it was paramount for countries as well as corporations to urgently deepen their understanding of climate risks and increase their awareness. Could you please expand on these thoughts?
Yes. So when we talk about climate risk, there are two types of risk. So one is physical risk, and another one is transition risk. Now, physical risk is what we are already experiencing, hazard right, arising from climate change. So already very hot temperatures, flood, hurricane everywhere. So that people kind of know, but people have to realize this physical risk is going to be more intensified in the future. So adaptation measures, we have to do much more. For example, agriculture, how to make agricultural farming system more resilient to the climate change. But more challenging issue is transition risk, because transition risk is coming from a policy change, such as carbon pricing. So carbon pricing means raising price related to consumption of fossil fuel, right? So like a carbon tax, exchange traded system. So that at this moment, many countries haven't done it yet. Yeah. So, but we have to do it in order to cope with this growing temperature. We have to do a policy as soon as possible. Now, what happens if each government become more serious about climate change? So they will try to discourage the consumption of coal and other fossil fuel by raising taxes, or prices, right? Then initially, the company will try to pass on those increased costs on their utility, electricity, utility prices, etc. So it becomes very expensive. Okay. Now, then some company, especially emission-intensive companies, they may have to exit because they cannot get profitability, a lot of profit. So restructuring will start. Now, that is good in the longer run, but temporarily, some community which depend on coal power plants, they lose a lot of profit and income in some community. So there will be a lot of social, social issue there. So when each government will try to introduce appropriate policy, there will be some restructuring of companies, and also some utility prices go up for a while. So public may not be happy. But so public have to understand, number one, that this policy is essential. And then number two, this restructuring, within the industry, within company is inevitable. So rather than try to avoid such kind of incident, we should try to support the new industry in some community and try to mitigate some, cost borne by low-income peoples. And more proactive is necessary. So basically, we have physical risk and the transition risk. And the transition risks are more challenging because it's very difficult for people to really understand and support, this type of risks.
Right. Talking about, I know you look at the whole of Asia, and you're an expert in the whole of Asia. But just because you're in Tokyo right now, could we specifically talk a little bit about Japanese corporations and how you would evaluate their disclosure and transition preparedness relative to other developed market peers or corporations around Asia?
So in general, Europe is far more advanced in every sense, So it's very difficult to compare with Europe. But in the case of Japan, large companies, like top 20, top 50 large companies, listed companies, they are already doing a lot of disclosure and action. The reason is that because their shareholders are also coming from Europe and US, and so they are very proactive and give a lot of pressure to the Japanese large companies. So Japanese companies, large one, they are quite well prepared, I think. But most of our companies, even listed company, we have like 2,000 listed companies. So I'm talking about only top 50. But other companies, they are not aware of this climate risk. So they haven't done much. And then they feel, it's so burdensome, to disclose. And why do I have to spend a lot of time to collect GHG data or, destruction, etc. So there are not much understanding among those companies. So, and even smaller companies, unlisted company, they don't know anything, and they don't want to listen to that. And they know, natural, hazards are happening, but they don't want to listen. And so that is a problem, I think, for many countries. Companies feel this is costly to cope with climate change, so just leave it. So how to deepen understanding of those companies is extremely challenging.
So we're talking about, again, capacity building, right? Because in the real world, and I've worked for corporations as well, and it's something you're very familiar with, you are all of a sudden asked to do a lot more work. You've got the same resources. It's going to take time. It's going to take money, and you don't really 100% understand why you should be doing it. So who is doing the capacity building? Is it the regulator? Is it is it the banks? Is it other entities who's doing the capacity building for the Japanese companies?
Okay, so let me talk about Japan and Asia. So at this moment, these climate-related disclosures, those are handled by financial authority, which are responsible for listing companies. So usually, financial services agency or like a security committee, it's not central bank.
Right.
Some authority deal with listing requirement, because basically this disclosure start with big listing company.
Yes, of course.
Okay, so basically it's there. So we try to focus on those authorities, and then frankly, actually, ASEAN countries, especially middle income ASEAN country and Singapore, are quite well advanced, and then they are so enthusiastic to really try to improve their disclosure, and then very energetic. I think because they know this physical risk is very serious, and they want to develop sustainable finance market. So they are very keen, and then try to talk to their small, medium enterprises, and then increase awareness. So I don't worry too much about middle income ASEAN countries. But for other Asian countries, they don't know. So what some countries are very they are aware of it. So they want to take action now to increase market. But other countries, they just left aside. So I think this might create some kind of a gap. Already there are a gap between, say, advanced country and emerging economy, but there will be new type of gap in terms of disclosure. Some regions, some countries, they are very serious about ISSB-based disclosure. Some countries, they don't know, they never heard of it, they are not willing to learn it. Then there will be gap. And I think direction money also be affected by this. So that's why we try to, target all Asian countries. And not just Southeast Asia or ASEAN, but all other Asian countries, because some of the countries might be left out. And then so there will be new type of problem. So that is my concern. So, we don't have a lot of finance, but we try to, for example, invite about 30 Asian countries. So April, we had invited one bureaucrat from 30 countries. And then we try to explain them, so what is climate risk, physical risk, and transition risk, and what kind of disclosure company have to do, what is ISSB standard, what is the GHG emission and protocol, all those, essence when we gave lecture for one day and a half. And so and some of them were really surprised because they didn't know. But I think this is a good starting point. So we will continue to do this kind of training. Also next year, we may try to do some joint capacity building workshop together with ISSB. And so we try to reach out as many countries as possible so that no country will be left out.
That's great. Based on your experience over the past few decades, are you pessimistic or optimistic about corporations in Japan and about corporations in the rest of Asia improving the disclosure, their climate risk mitigation and their transition in general over the next, 10 years, over the next 20 years?
It's very difficult to answer. I like to be optimistic. In terms of large companies, I don't worry anything about them. They are well prepared, like very big Japanese company and a commercial bank, so as main Asian big companies. They are well prepared. They know what they need to do. So the program is a sort of middle-sized companies, small company, unlisted company. They don't know much. So there is a gap also between these two type of companies. And also, most importantly, the people understanding about climate change and what they need to do among the general public is far more challenging. Because without people's understanding, even company try to make their effort and try to produce, low carbon products and services. Who is going to buy it, right? So we need general consumers' understanding, and they should support those companies' behavior. So at this moment, when I look at a lot of Asia, compared to Europe, I think this degree of understanding among general public is relatively low. So not only small companies, but also general public. I think every government should start to teach, small children from like kindergarten, elementary school, and tell them what's happening about climate change and what do we need to do. I teach this climate change to university students, but sometimes they are already if they knew this information much earlier and start to take some positive action, at a much early childhood, probably it's much better. So I think, just deepening the understanding among general public and companies are very challenging. And I think every government have to do much more effort. And then try to teach young people, from, early childhood. This is absolutely necessary.
And for Japan, over the next, in my personal experience of view, over the past 10 years, the Japanese government has made some improvements, but it hasn't not been very aggressive. In my personal experience, I don't know if you share that thought. But do you see that over the next 5, 10, 15 years, there's going to be a serious acceleration? Because obviously, Japan will be very much affected by climate change, given its analysis.
Yes. So government try to use the word GX, green sort of transformation. It's a Japanese, terminology. It's called GX. So try to, promote, climate finance, sort of a financial market. Try to, do some climate policies. Yeah. So some people know about it, but majority of people and the companies, they don't know. So that is an issue. I really think so. There are so many smart Japanese people, but unfortunately, people just take this, high temperature as it is. They don't think where these causes come from, and so it's very unfortunate. And so, I also talk a lot, but only people who are interested in these topics, they pay attention, right? So on the media, TV, and they talk about this natural hazard all the time. But, if people are not serious about it, they never take it, as their own, right? Just as somebody else's issue. So that kind of attitude is there. So I think, government, if they really want to cope with this climate change, I think in compulsory education, I think climate change should be one of the subjects. I hear that in the United States, some states, they include climate change as a compulsory subject for high school students. So that is really good. I think it has to be compulsory. But I think it's better to start from, elementary school.
Early age. and to build a sense of urgency, which over the last few years, maybe the Japanese government has not had. Shirai-san, I'm very, very, very grateful for your time today. Thank you for answering all of my questions. It's been a really, really wonderful conversation. 本当にどうもありがとうございました、今日は。
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Asia Climate Finance Podcast. Please note that the Asia Climate Finance Podcast is presented for educational purposes only. All information in the podcast must not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. Also, please note that the views and opinions expressed by our guests are personal and may not represent the views and opinions of current or previous employers.